Honored to be here with these gentlemen tonight. I'll come back to them in a moment. To Bob and Holly Kimmett, great to be with you. You're role models for Tammy and me when we assume post. Steve Sokol, and I should say to all the board members. Steve Sokol and your team, congratulations on another great year. You do extraordinary work, and the board and the staff works together, I happen to know quite well. It's an honor to be with Teaneck, New Jersey's own Paul Volcker, with his wife Anka, who are here tonight. Dr. Henry Kissinger is in the house. I actually, with our family, have been to a football game with Dr. Kissinger, and that's an experience that I would recommend to all of you. To Rick Hunt, congratulations, sir, to your award. You became the University Marshal at Harvard 3 years after Chris Flowers and I graduated. It reminded me of a story. Our commencement speaker, Chris, you may remember, was Helmut Schmidt, the then Chancellor of Germany. And Schmidt became, in my later life, and at the very later in his life, a very close friend. And I one day said to him, Herr Schmidt, I just want you to know that the first taste of Germany I had was you were my commencement speaker at Harvard College. And it made an incredible, deep, lasting impact on me, and I've never forgotten that moment. And I said, do you remember that moment at all? And a classic Schmidt took a drag of a cigarette and said, Mr. Murphy, I don't remember one speck of it. That certainly put me in my place.
It's because you said Herr Schmidt.
I said, he wanted to be called Herr Schmidt. He wanted to be called Herr Schmidt. Mrs. Murphy, well done. God bless you for flying in today. And we got a lot of friends here. I want to make a comment about these two gentlemen. Paul is one of my oldest and our oldest and dearest friends. As Tammy mentioned, his wife, Dr. Ann-Christine Kohlberg Achleitner, is with us tonight. Their eldest child, Nicholas, is with us. They're an incredible family. Richard Fisher, I think, Richard, I said this to you on your last visit to me. You were my most frequent visitor from the United States to Germany during my time as ambassador. So this is someone who, in his capacity as the president and CEO of the Dallas Fed, and as a real transatlanticist and a member of this board, lived it, not just in name, but in action. It's a school night, as you mentioned, so we're going to be, from this moment on, I'll be short in the questions and we'll be short in the answers. Is that all right? And so let's go. I'm going to start with Richard, and then I'd love Paul to chime in. The Fed today, a buddy on Wall Street said, lower, longer. How do you react if you had the car keys to the Fed unto yourself, Richard? What would you be doing? And then I'm going to ask Paul, if you took them from Mario Draghi and the ECB, what would you be doing? We'll start with Richard. Great to be with you.
I'd pull over to the curb and I'd get out of the car and walk away. Well, first of all, we're sitting in front of Paul Volcker, the Moses of central banking.
We're going to come to Paul in a moment.
And it's a little bit difficult to answer in front of Paul. We're in a very awkward situation. We have negative interest rates in Germany out to 10 years. We're floating money with abundance throughout the world. We are, I think, still the epicenter of global economic growth here in North America. I include Mexico, by the way, with 130 million people as part of North America, having implemented NAFTA for President Clinton. And then our great European counterparts are still struggling with trying to get a unified public growth, of course led by Germany, as they always are. But I think this is a very difficult period. And I worry, personally, that we have driven interest rates to such low levels that we are jeopardizing the basic financial institutions that are the backbones of our society. Insurance companies, banks, I noticed you nodding when I said that, and also the money market funds that middle income groups really depend on to put their savings in and to protect them for the future. So that's the negative consequence of the desire we have, lower interest rates to generate economic growth, and there's a cost involved. I tend to be a little bit pessimistic, as you know, Mr. Ambassador, on that front, and I look to the kind of leadership that this man is exerting to help pull us out. And I think he made a very good point. It is totally useless to demonize the leaders of financial institutions. Because again, they're the ones that protect our savings, help us grow, finance the means for economic growth. And right now, because of regulatory pressures, and these hyper low interest rates were making their job extremely difficult. So if I were given that position of responsibility again, someone said the other day, if you were king, what would you do? I would abdicate.
You'd abdicate. You pull the car over and abdicate.
That's right.
Dr. Achleitner, what would you be
Very
doing?
interesting, because I think if this may not be very popular, but I think we got to come to the realization it's all about micro and not about macro.
That's right.
I think that we are actually experiencing that the belief that has driven us, since the war, that somehow we can either through Keynesian and fiscal measures or through monetary measures just manage growth, has come to certain limits. We have found the limits of fiscal stimulus, in the debt situations that everybody found themselves in, and I think we are right now experiencing the, how shall I say, the limits of what monetary, particularly quantitative easing, can actually do. And we may just have to come to the conclusion that maybe we cannot manage growth from above, if I may use it that way. But maybe it's all about micro, i.e. Initiatives, entrepreneurial stuff, other ways of generating growth.
Making it easier to start businesses.
Yeah, I mean, many of these things just, you also have to understand that there are different there are different behavior patterns in psychology today. We've got the technological impact, all these things that would take us a little bit too long. But let me just point out the most obvious example as we talk here about Germany and the U.S. If you give the U.S. consumer $100 more, he or she is likely to spend it. You give the German consumer $100 more, they're going to save it. And you say, how can they save it if there's negative interest rates? People look at that and see negative interest rates as a warning signal that the future is going to be even less safe than it is today, and they'll save even more.
Yep.
So it becomes counterproductive.
Before you go micro, for each of you gentlemen, there has been over the past 6-7 years limited, if any, enthusiasm for fiscal stimulus, either in the United States or in Europe. And one could argue, and I'll pick the US, which I would know better, that we have a legitimate, long and growing list of projects that are worthy of investment, particularly in the field of infrastructure. Do either of you see, either in Europe, Paul, or Richard, in the United States, any change of sentiment in the near future, such that you might have a couple of levers that can be pulled here, not just the monetary lever, but that you can actually have smart fiscal policy?
Well, infrastructure is not, this is not a problem of a lack of funding. There are, it's a question of lack of real projects that are manageable and attractive. You will find enough private sector funding for infrastructure projects if you just define them right and give opportunities, because people are looking for yield. So, take big pools of money, take insurance companies. They want to invest in infrastructure, but they need certainty in terms of the regulatory environment, and they need precise opportunities as far as the returns are concerned, and then they will invest. So this isn't something where you just need to ask for public spending and more deficit spending by governments that are already over-indebted. If you look into digital infrastructure, give telecom companies and others a clear-cut regulatory environment so that they can actually, know what's happening if they pour the billions into glass fiber cables or whatever the hell it may be that they invest in order to build out the infrastructure, and you'll get the funding. I don't think there's a funding problem.
How about the transatlantic?
Well, first of all, Paul used a critical word, which is uncertainty. Uncertainty is the enemy of decision making, and we need to have greater clarity. So you mentioned telecoms. I'm just going to take this up. I'm on the board of AT&T. We're the largest CapEx investor in America. We invest over $20 billion a year. But we deal with this constant uncertainty with regulation in the United States. So I think the solution is, if you'll allow me to say this, Paul, is just to elect a good senator from New Jersey. What do you think?
Governor.
Okay. No, seriously, we really need to have some fiscal discipline, of which we have none. In a way, the central banks are underwriting a lack of discipline because they've lowered the cost of money and let them get away with what they've gotten away with. And we need to completely rewrite and start from zero-based budgeting the way we regulate our economies, and I'm speaking here particularly about the United States. The Federal Register is additive, not subtractive, and we have regulations on there that still are pre-World War II, some that are still overhanging from the Cold War. And we need to rewrite the regulatory structure to encourage capital formation and job creation and adjusting to modernity. And you can't just do it through monetary policy, whether it's negative interest rates or low interest rates here in the United States.
Agreed.
If I may add to that, because I think it shows a huge difference, and bear with me, of course I have to say this, but there's a huge difference in the banking sector. Quantitative easing in the US, okay, was preceded by a total recapitalization of the banking sector, okay, which our old friend Hank Paulson actually initiated with the help of Ken Wilson, who is here in the room, and others. And you recapitalized and stabilized the banking system. And then you actually had quantitative easing so that the banks could actually fulfill that transmission mechanism, okay, that was necessary to get that money from the central bank down into, quote unquote, the real economy. The problem we have in Europe is you actually have the central bank right now out there sending easy money, actually discouraging banks from keeping money with them, okay? Yep. But the banks cannot hand that money on to the real economy because at the very same point, they are being driven, ironically, by the ECB as a regulator to reduce their balance sheets, okay, massively. So if I'm asked to reduce my balance sheet massively, so how should I take that money and actually lend it out and create, ever-increasing loan volume and other risk-weighted assets on my balance sheet? Right. So therefore, the transmission mechanism isn't working, and we shouldn't be surprised that it isn't working until we have that fixed.
You mentioned in your remarks, by the way, one thing I want to underscore is the vision that was shown by leaders in both Germany and in Europe and the United States in the late 1940s and early 50s. Decisions, forward-leaning vision that we benefit from to this day, and we should, all of us, hope that we can get back to that sort of forward-leaning, sort of visionary leadership, and McCloy and Warburg and Lucius Clay and George Marshall and others deserve enormous credit. You mentioned Brexit in your remarks. Put aside what you think about it or not, what's your handicap as to whether or not it's going to happen? Paul, I'll start with you and go to Richard. And what's the real, give us, each of you, give us a real tangible impact that will hit us if in fact it does happen?
Well, first of all, I'm staking my my hopes on the bookies as opposed to the surveys, because the London bookies and betting industry still is in the Remain camp and still thinks that Britain will not leave. I hope they're right.
You'll permit me to lead the following.
Yes, thank you. I hope they were right, because if it actually works the other way, it's an economic disaster for the UK and it's a political disaster for the EU.
And how is it read in the United States, Richard?
Well, we read what we read in the press, and so you have the FT averages, and it's rather even, and then you have the betting parlors, as you mentioned. Actually, last week I was in both London and Frankfurt. But while I was in London, I went into Ladbrokes, and one of the great betting parlors. I realized after talking to them that I could move that entire market with £700,000. So it's awfully thin, and it's being manipulated. And I don't feel it's a reliable indicator, but I share with Paul my wish that it was a reliable indicator. Because I don't think it's a constructive thing.
Should Americans care?
Of course they should care, because we should care.
Give us a little bit more on that.
Well, again, in the tradition of this great institution in the Atlantic Brücke, we care about a successful Europe. It's our largest trading partner, and it's important that it work with as smooth a functionality as possible. And of course, the Brits kept their own currency, but they're a critical player in terms of defining the Atlantic Alliance. And to undo this, it is so complicated. Just look at landing rights. There'd have to be 80 different agreements that have to be renegotiated. There are 39,524 regulations that would have to be renegotiated. I could walk you through one thing after another, but the point is you would be tearing apart the fabric of what we've all dreamed about, which is a united Europe, not a disjointed Europe.
Paul, does the man on the street, so to speak, on the continent get this? Do they think about it? Are they internalizing it?
I think the proverbial man in the street is a difficult topic these days, because I think what you see is the anti-establishment versus establishment discussion that you have in your presidential campaign, and frankly, Brexit is nothing different. But What's happening is the UK politicians are just ducking and say, you talk about big government, those are the guys over there in Brussels. And therefore they vent all that frustration in that direction. And of course, on the continent, you have a lot of the same kind of sentiments. And given the fact that European politicians have spent the last few decades, whenever they had to do something that wasn't popular with their voters, to say, look guys, I wouldn't have done that to you, but these guys in Brussels didn't leave me any choice. So therefore, here we are. You know that Brussels isn't going to win any popularity contest. Yep. By the way, the famous bureaucrats of the European Union are fewer than the amount of civil servants in Bavaria.
Have to think about that.
Just to think about facts. Those are just
you
facts.
need to reduce the number of civil servants in Bavaria, obviously.
There are.
Switch gears for a second, as we're rounding third, as they say in baseball, and heading home, recognizing we have the father of the Volcker rule, not 20 feet in front of us. Paul and then Richard, if you could change, if you had a magic wand to change one regulation under which you operate, what would you change? And I know you're going to say the list is long.
Only one. I'd like to have, my one is a principle, I'd like to truly have a level playing field between the US and Europe, which on a regulatory scale, lots of lip service is being paid to her, but it doesn't exist.
Good answer. Richard, how about you? If there's one regulation you could change, what would you change?
Well, I'm not sure what the regulation would be, but I can tell you that and Paul obviously could talk about this much better. But
the other Paul.
Yeah, not this guy, he doesn't, but the Moses of banking. But what we see in effect is that basically the risk warehouses, which are the financial institutions, and where you used to get another side of a transaction, the shock absorbers are being taken out of the system. Mm-hmm. And it's created a dysfunctional bond market here in the United States, and I think to a limited extent, your bond market's not as active also in Europe. I would like to see that change because I think we're going to suffer from that long term.
Good answers, both. One big picture question and a couple of buzzer rounds. Different questions for each of you. Richard, what's the prospect that we could reanimate real bipartisan governance in this country? And Paul, what's the prospect that we can reanimate the European project in its very best sense within our respective lifetimes?
Well, I hope it happens within our respective lifetimes, although none of us are young sitting on this stage.
That's true.
I really find this presidential election to be horrifically scary. And yet it's an expression of sort of the nonpartisanship and separation that we've had. And what made this country great was the fact that we had leaders that cooperated with each other. Rick referred to Senator Mathias.
Yeah.
He was a team player. We don't see people like that anymore in public life. I think it started, forgive me, with Newt Gingrich and that crowd, and then on the Democratic side, you had their counterparts. And right now, you see that incredible division in the presidential election that we have. And yet, I want to remind you, we did suffer through Andrew Jackson, who closed the second bank of the United States and had an immense populist Tea Party type mentality. There's something regenerative about Americans, and they always come out in the end. So I refuse to be pessimistic.
I love that. Paul, what about Europe?
Look, I think the European project will be re-energized one way or another after the Brexit vote, okay? Because
Even if it's a negative?
well, if it's a negative, it will have to be re-energized because the remainders will have to prove that this isn't just the first of many to come. So you will actually have, you will find people trying for new, one project that is an obvious one is there's going to be an attempt anyway to move more into a defense union and security union, including a common frontier, because you can't have the Schengen open borders, but forget that you need to protect your outer frontiers. The question of a defense union would be a very good Franco-German project, because it's an area where the French are clearly superior to the Germans, and that's probably a good way to start, given everything else. Okay. So you will see some of that, and even if the UK stays in, you will actually then see attempts that may actually have more British involvement of moving to a two-speed type of Europe, in the sense that there'll be different concentric circles, or whatever the hell you want to call it, where people will actually tie up themselves in certain principal areas, be it Schengen, being the EU, be it a defense environment, and so on and so forth. It becomes much more flexible than what it used to be.
Some quick buzzer round questions before we go. Paul, the far-right parties in Europe, have they peaked, or do we still see higher levels to come? Obviously, your homeland of Österreich had a near fatal collision there.
I think they're far from peaking. I think you will continue to have the same phenomenon that we actually have, that you see over here, which isn't just Donald Trump, but it's Bernie Sanders. It's the establishment versus non-establishment. It's, I just learned, I had the privilege with Henry Kissinger to be in Dresden this past weekend on a conference where I first understood that the guy who actually coined the term precariat wasn't talking about somebody who are close to being homeless. They're talking about people whose expectation about the future is precarious. They don't know what it means. That can be university graduates who actually just go from one job to the next because they never wanted to take up a real job, but they actually do computer coding, okay? And they take one job after the next, which sounds all very great until you are in your 40s, and then you don't have a job for 6-8 months, and suddenly your expectation about the future is very insecure. So as long as we have, and I can't see why this would immediately change, also driven by technology and geopolitical events, have as high a level of insecurity that people have about where things are going, you will have anti-establishment type of votes. You will have these type of votes, which you actually see here from all the left, okay, which are against big business, the right, which are against big government, and you see all of that over there too. And I don't see how that is going to go away, unfortunately, anytime soon.
We see it here without question. Gordon Johnson is here, my friend from New Jersey, elected assemblyman. We see it in New Jersey. There's a huge anti-establishment piece. You see it all over the United States. Richard, who's the next president of the United States? And simple question. And how would you guess that the losing party will heal itself?
I don't know who the next president of the United States will be, and I'm not willing to venture a guess. I'm not happy with the choices. It's interesting. You have this phenomenon of Donald Trump, or in London you have perhaps the next chancellor, not chancellorship, but prime ministership of England, Boris Johnson, who's, even with his hairdo, looks like Don Trump. I don't understand the phenomenon except for rebellion without clarity of expression. And yet Hillary Clinton, and as you know, I worked for her husband, I served in his administration.
I do.
What encouraged me about Bill Clinton was, here was a Democrat who ran pro-NAFTA and stood in front of union halls and said, I'm in favor of this kind of trade agreement. I don't see that coming from Mrs. Clinton. And in fact, she's running away from the principles that bind us as a global community. So I'm equally frightened by Hillary Clinton, and I'm equally frightened by Donald Trump. As a result of that, I can assure you I will serve or not be asked to serve either president, no matter who is elected president of the United States.
I just want to say for the record, I'm not equally frightened, I have to say. I'm far more frightened about one than the other.
I don't know who the next president of the United States will be, but I hope she will pay a lot of attention to Europe.
Amen. So we got one more question. You guys, and by the way, Richard encouraged me to ask about the time that he borrowed or stole a tuxedo to host a dinner for Helmut Kohl. We're going to have to do that next time.
Needless to say, if it was his tuxedo, I wouldn't fit.
Exactly. There are 2 soccer tournaments being played at the same time. And the summation of these tournaments gives us an atmosphere right now in football, as our European brothers and sisters would say, somewhat akin to the World Cup. You've got the European Championship in Europe, and you've got the Copa America Championship, which is North and South and Central America, being played in the United States. So the most important question of the night will be, Paul, who will win the Euro, and Richard, who will win the Copa?
Paul?
Well, as a European, my biggest hopes are on England. Not that they win, but as long as they stay in there until the referendum.
Distracted from
the referendum, they should win as much as possible. Okay. That would be a big one. And apart from that, one could actually hope that, and it's quite conceivable, that France might actually end up winning, given their fighting spirit that they show not only in the streets but also on the soccer field.
Richard? In my case, and particularly in the spirit of this evening, I grew up as an ardent fan and admirer of Kaiser Franz Beckenbauer. And to me, the greatest footballer of all time. But unfortunately, he's not playing in the Copa America.
He's not playing the Copa.
So
he would have liked, though.
Yeah, that's right. I always root for the United States, but I would say if not us, it would have to be Mexico.
Mexico, which, by the way, if you don't know Richard's background, he grew up in Mexico, and they've got one of the best teams in the world.
Yeah. And Mexico, to me, is the most successful example of economic adjustment that we see, and frankly, the best run government in our hemisphere.
Yeah. I'll tell you something. It is a rare night for me, I'll speak for myself, when you can hear from the likes of Paul Achleitner, Richard Fisher, Bob Kimmett, Henry Kissinger, Paul Volcker, Rick Hunt, and while I'm keeping my eye on the Federal Republic of New Jersey, Tammy Murphy, who keeps her eye on the Federal Republic of Germany. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Paul, it's a pleasure.